Theodore Dalrymple, otherwise known as Dr. Anthony Daniels. Welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for asking me.
I think it's fair to say it's a common conservative refrain to exclaim that the world has gone to the dogs. And if you do look at images from the Britain of old, perhaps pre-1970s, but indeed even a little bit after that, you can see a safe, happy and pretty well-dressed country. But it doesn't really matter if you were to put these images up in front of people who think we are making big progress towards some sunny uplands. They would say, no, it's not going to the dogs. We're clearly getting much better. I'm not necessarily convinced by that, but I'll let you make the case, if indeed there's one to make, that what in your estimation is the current state of the country and by extension, its culture?
Well, the idea that there has been progress is not entirely false. When you talk about when I was born, for example, my life expectancy was 66 years, and now the life expectancy is 80 male at birth. So that is progress, and no one would wish to go back to the telephone system of old, where to telephone more than 30 miles away was a kind of effort of Hercules. So there has been undoubted technical progress, but technical progress is not the same as moral progress, although there has been some moral progress as well. However, there is undoubtedly a feeling, and I don't think it's an unreasonable feeling, that there's a kind of deterioration as well. I was recently writing an essay, and I found something that was very striking. In a book I was reading about juvenile delinquents, I read that in 1938 in this country, there were 8,750 prisoners. If you take, now we have about 10 times as many. If you take the increase in population, we have perhaps 6 times as many prisoners as we did. But it's not just that. For each prisoner, there are now 6 times more indictable crimes than there were in 1938. In other words, if you just put this together, you've got 36 times as many crimes now as in 1938. Well, of course, you can't just extrapolate quite like that. But nevertheless, there is no doubt that a country that was almost as crime-free as any large society ever is or ever will be, we have gone to an extremely high rate of crime. And that seems to me a very serious indictment of our society. And we can talk about why that should have occurred. But I don't think you could just say that because we have more indoor lavatories and everyone has a colored television, that this necessarily means that we have made progress in all fields.
Well, you teed me up for the next question. So what are the key influences that have led to both the increase in crime and, as you see it, the migration, I suppose, of culture at large?
Well, I suppose it must really stem from the spread of certain ideas, and those ideas come from intellectuals and the academy. And they have so undermined our society that people like the police no longer have any idea what they're supposed to be doing. In 1938, a policeman would have known what he was supposed to be doing. If you were a little boy and you were behaving badly, he'd pull you by the ear and say, here, stop that. And if he did that now, of course, he would be accused of the most abominable violence. But the police, for example, do not know what they're supposed to be doing. And of course, bureaucrats prefer doing things which involve a lot of desk work and so on, and are not at all dangerous. So, of course, supervising COVID was very pleasant for them as against trying to catch burglars, which is hazardous and rather difficult. So They don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Teachers don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Nobody knows what he is supposed to be doing. And that comes from a kind of skepticism, which has been spread, I think, by the extension of universities. And of course, is a bureaucratic opportunity for people. Once you educate people, you have to employ them. So because they're very dangerous if you don't employ them. And incidentally, I first thought about this in Central America, oddly enough, when I was in Guatemala. I was writing a book about Guatemala and the civil war in Guatemala, and I came to the conclusion that the violence and the violent revolutionary movements, they were not spontaneous movements of the peasantry. They were of university-educated types who were disappointed, I think, by the fact that university no longer implied joining an elite because there were too many people at universities. And something similar has, not exactly the same, but something similar has happened in Britain, I think.
Is that a common theme about the overproduction, I suppose, of cultural elites, that it can lead to kind of disappointment that the entitlement hasn't been achieved? Because if I'm thinking correctly, and you can certainly put me right on this if I'm not, is that not also similar to the rise of the Nazi movement in Germany, that it was there's a groundswell of support from the disaffected youth and the students of the day? Is that right? Is this something we're seeing as a theme?
Well, I suppose there's a vague analogy, but I would put it more with I would say the analogy with Latin America is actually stronger, and also with Russia of the 19th century. You can see the intelligentsia produced the catastrophe that Russia is even now not able to overcome. So obviously it's just this isn't a perfect explanation or anything like that. And to some extent, you're better able to say than I, since you appear to be younger than I, and so you would know more people in the age group I'm talking about than I. But it does seem a reasonable partial explanation.
Okay. Skepticism, that was a point you brought up earlier, which has contributed to the cultural degradation that we've experienced. And we often talk about it beginning, particularly post-World War, as a big break, I suppose, from what came before. And indeed, you can spot that, obviously, big anti-establishment rhetoric that starts creeping into the academy. And I've always been convinced that was the moment it really started. But then I'd be interested in getting your view on this. I've been reading a book in the last few days called God's Funeral by A.N. Wilson. It was published 25 years ago, and it was about the loss of faith in the Victorian era, and just how seismic a shift it was for the people at the time, intelligentsia, their own cultural elite, and then for the working people, when all of these age-old certainties were being stripped away because scientific endeavour, suicide was going through the roof, and a lot of the media started to be unbelieving in its outlook, and it was a big change, and it made me realise that when I think about skepticism, I was born in the late 80s, grew up through the 90s and 2000, and I remember being that militant atheist, tearing down the old order, but really I was actually just bombing the rubble of what was already there, this very anti-establishment view. And I thought, oh God, I've been brought up in this godless era, this kind of anti-establishment era that began post-World War. But actually it seems to have begun earlier than that. Maybe that's the ancestor of all of that anti-establishment feeling.
Well, of course, yes. I mean, you can't say, well, it all started on the 17th of April, such and such a date, at 2:30 in the afternoon. You can't say that. But I think the First World War actually was the biggest catastrophe to overcome Western Europe, or Europe overcame Eastern Europe as well. So I think and the Second World War was, if you like, the cherry on the cake of degradation. I think, after the catastrophic First World War, people naturally ask themselves, I mean, I don't think it's an unreasonable question, if this is what our civilization ends up producing, what is the value of our civilization? And I think if, for example, you look at modernist architecture, I think probably people like Le Corbusier and Gropius would just have been regarded as crank, and they were cranks, of course, but they wouldn't have been successful if there had been no First World War, and people would just say, well, they're cranks. So I think the First World War, from that point of view, was probably the most important event in explaining this. Not that there were there were, of course, rumblings before the First World War. So, I mean, you can't actually, as I said, find the point at which we started. I suppose you'd end up thinking of the Garden of Eden if you thought like that. But I think the First World War was an extremely important turning point.
Pete Hitchens made a similar point on this podcast, where he said that there was a moral exhaustion came off the back of that, and it opened the door for all of the various, as you just said, different worldviews that were ultimately setting themselves counter to whatever the prevailing culture had been. And indeed, Ed West, I talk about this all the time, has said that pre-World War I civilization was recognisably the same up to the Middle Ages, but from that point it really went through quite a big break. I know you're not a man to make predictions, so I won't ask you to do that, but people often go, right, if we're now in a recognisably different civilization, perhaps we're just morally exhausted. There's little resources, there are a few resources to pull on, or that people are willing to pull on. What are the prospects for a civilization that has cut itself off from its root, and where could the obvious sources of our civilizational sustenance come from, if ever?
And well, that's extremely. That is a very difficult question. Of course, I always recommend people to read my books. That's the first. Stage of recovery.
Click order now, listeners.
I don't really have any. I don't have any large-scale predictions. I think the predicament of Britain is particularly bad. It's worse than in France, but France is only 20 years behind us, or something like that. And if you ask what we can do about it, or the only thing I've ever been able to come up with is to do our best and not to live by lies, for example, not to accept the absurdities that are now passed for truths. Because actually, there's a very strange paradox. On the one hand, people are extremely skeptical, but on the other hand, they're very dogmatic about certain tenets. And I can give you an example, and I've given it before, and I hope people will forgive me for repeating myself, but I've only got a limited repertoire. I had a patient, a young girl who was about 17 at the time, and I asked her what she wanted to do, and she wanted to be a lawyer. And I said, what kind of law do you want to do? And she said, I want to be a human rights lawyer, with a kind of beatific smile on her face, as if she just got I suppose 100 years ago she would have wanted to be a nun. But so I said, well, that's interesting. I said, where do human rights come from? And, and she said, what do you mean? I said, well, do you go out and discover them? I mean, are they always there? Are we like Columbus? We go out and discover a human right? Or where do they come from? And she said, you can't ask that. And it's true that it was a kind of slightly cruel because she was only 17. But there was a certainty about her belief in the unequivocal goodness and justification of human rights that would not brook any question about them at all. And my impression was, and it's only an impression, I can't say that I'm correct, my impression is she would probably go through life, or at least go through a lot of life, including career, never questioning the fundaments of her viewpoint. But on the other hand, if she was on a train and she had put her feet up on the seat and you said to her, I don't think you should put your feet up on the seat, she would immediately turn into a moral philosopher and demand a kind of Archimedean point from which I could prove beyond all possible argument that one shouldn't put one's feet up on a seat in a train. And in fact, more than once I've had that discussion, and people say that their feet are clean, or it's not going to do any harm, in the sense that no one's going to get cholera from it or anything like that. So, in other words, their skepticism is a kind of skepticism that justifies a lack of self-discipline. But when it comes to the fundamental ideas that will give them a living, then they are not very skeptical. On the contrary, they believe in it as firmly as any Latin American peasant believes in the miracle working virgin in his local church.
Very sage point. This leads me on to something I wanted to talk about that you've written in one of your essays, which I read within your collection, Our Culture, What's Left of It. And as a bit of a preamble to a quote before we get to unpack it a little bit, it's commonly understood for anyone who has any semblance of understanding around political philosophy that there is this leftist idea, I suppose, came from Antonio Gramsci, about if you want to change society, you need to hunker down for the long haul, get into the institutions and mold the institutions in your own image, and then you've got your hands on the levers of power and you can have society that you want, the long march through the institutions. So you wrote, Theodore, Anthony, there has been a long march not just through the institutions but through the minds of the young. When young people want to praise themselves, they describe themselves as non-judgmental. For them, the highest form of morality is amorality. That's quite clear. What are, in your eyes, the consequences for a society of widespread non-judgmentalism?
Well, non-judgmentalism is, of course, inherently hypocritical and self-contradictory, because, of course, if you think that not making a judgment is a good thing to do or not to do, then you are making a judgment. So my point would be that making judgments is part of our existence. I don't think we could live, I don't know how long, I haven't timed it, but I don't think we can live for very long without making judgments. And the problem with judgments is, of course, that they sometimes turn out to be wrong. So you mustn't be inflexible in your judgments. But that's not the same, and many of your judgments will be wrong. But that's not the same as saying, I'm getting rid of judgment altogether, because you can't. And if you claim to do something that you can't do, then you are turned into a liar. Essentially, you're turned into a liar. You're lying about yourself. You're lying about what you really think. So a society of liars is a society that is, first of all, it's very unpleasant. It's a society in which the most ruthless people will come to the top, and it's a society in which people will be very easily manipulated. So so the claim that we don't make a judgment is nonsense. It's nonsense in intellectual judgment. It's also, of course, self-congratulatory. It's hypocritical and self-congratulatory. It's false. And actually, at heart, it's ridiculous.
What do you think's behind it? Is it, picking up on that self-congratulatory point, is it a kind of moral narcissism? Is it a cowardice, not wanting to judge a culture which you actually may well have decided is inferior in some way? What is it that drives people to be non-judgmental?
Well, there's a cowardice is a very important element of it. So that, for example, I would say the medical profession is very cowardly with regard to the problem of addiction, particularly to opiates. The addiction to, I mean, it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but everything I say is a bit of a hobby horse. But we have, for example, turned addiction to opiates into a kind of illness which is in the same category, shall we say, as multiple sclerosis or motor neuron disease. It's something that just happens and you don't make a contribution to it. But this is obviously false. And what we are trying to do by saying that it's just an illness is to exculpate completely the person who is addicted. And the reason for that is you don't want to seem horrible or censorious. The most terrible thing you can say about anybody now is that he is censorious. Now, censoriousness is an unpleasant attribute or characteristic. There's no doubt about that. And you can easily make a very wrong judgment. I'll give you an example of a very wrong judgment of mine. I mean, it didn't result in any tragedy or anything like that. But I was on a bus recently, and it was a bus journey that took about 45 minutes. And there was a young woman, a rather beautiful young woman, in front of me. And she was dolling herself up the whole way. I mean, I don't know how you can spend 40 minutes dolling yourself up with various paints and powders and things like that, but that's what she did. And in the end, inwardly, I didn't say anything, of course, but I was rather irritated. I thought, this is terrible. You know, what kind of culture is this in which people spend 40 minutes dolling themselves up in this ridiculous way? And then she got off the bus before me at a bus stop before I was going to get off. And she was actually smartly dressed. But I saw, as soon as she got off, that she had a terrible withered leg and that she was limping terribly. And so that actually walking was a huge effort for her, really. It wasn't something she could just take for granted. And suddenly I saw the tragedy of her existence, in fact. And I understood then why making herself up might be so enormously important to her. And so my initial judgment was wrong. And it was hasty. And I'm sure I will make it again if I see it again, the same kind of thing. People are so afraid of being wrong and hasty in that way that they claim not to want to make any judgment. And in order to not to make any judgment, they turn what is a moral question into one that is simply a physiological one.
Yes.
And that comes from a certain cowardice because they don't want to be wrong. Because, as I said, censoriousness is an unpleasant characteristic.
this is something I've seen a lot. I've got my own experience with people who've dealt with issues that are do with addiction, specifically alcohol. And a lot of people within my milieu, as it were, took the line of, well, it's an illness. And it was a sensitive time over many years. And you don't necessarily want to come across as the heartless person who suggests that there is agency on the part of the other person, that it wasn't that they just landed in that position. And it's a hard pill for people to swallow, I think, because when people are suffering, you must feel like you don't want to turn the screw, and yet I think we try to avoid the evidence of our eyes and ears. And sometimes I wonder whether this links back to this skepticism point or this destruction of the old order, because I suppose if you go and walk around any of our Gothic cathedrals or churches, and you can go and find the 7 deadly sins chiseled into the wall, the dance with death, your final judgment, as it were, this idea that you have to answer to something beyond yourself at the end of your times. And in many cases, it's trying to push you quite forcibly onto the path of virtue and say, you're a worthless sinner. And I suppose therapy culture that has sprung up in the place of that old way of seeing runs counter to that. It says, no, that was actually really deleterious to the human mind, and actually it's better that we just accept there are things out of our control. But I'm not too sure I see the benefit for each of us in denying this agency, because then it almost makes it look like we have no say whatsoever in how our existence pans out or how we respond to the cards that were dealt, even if they're hard.
Yes, I mean, that, of course, hands power over to other people, of course. I mean, if you have no agency, then someone must act on your behalf. I mean, one has to be, as I said, censoriousness is very unpleasant. And in the 1920s, for example, people were still, unwed mothers were still put in mental hospitals for having had a child out of wedlock, which was then regarded as something outrageous to do. And there was a lot of censoriousness about it. And that was very unpleasant because, in particular, and this strikes me as terribly cruel and stupid, the child itself was blamed for the fact that it was illegitimate. I mean, that happened. And that's terrible. On the other hand, if you have a society in which people don't care where their children come from, as it were, I used to interview 16-year-old children or adolescents. If you ask them who their father was, would say, well, do you mean my father at the moment? Or they would simply deny that they had one. So they were, I suppose, children of virgin birth or something. But anyway, it was so self-evident to me that this is catastrophic socially, and that it leads to the state being father to the child, in fact. This is catastrophic. That it seemed to me that we've lost the ability to tread between, on the one hand, being horribly censorious, and on the other hand, denying people any agency, any moral agency. And so you're constantly having to estimate and so on. If you take things like drug addiction or addiction in general, of course, it has medical consequences. And the doctor doesn't say to the patient, you are responsible for your situation, depart my sight and never come back, whatever your situation, because it's all your own silly fault. You don't say that. But on the other hand, if you deny someone their agency, then you deny them the possibility of contributing to their overcoming of their own personal problem, which is a lie, and is a lie, incidentally. It's a lie.
And on top of that, I suppose for those people who commit heinous acts against others, you can see this quite clearly in how we talk about crime. I think the response to the terrible Southport atrocities committed by Axel Radicubana against the 3 young girls, and indeed the other victims who got away with their lives, the narrative that immediately spun around our newspapers, led by figures like Idris Elba, talked about the response to this should be rounding the ends of kitchen knives, as though the knives were the things that had conducted the atrocity. And there seems to be
if I may interrupt you, I mean, the first essay I ever wrote in the City Journal was called "The Knife Went In," because every murderer who had stabbed someone to death and was in prison always described the crime as the knife went in, as if the knife were guiding the hand rather than the hand guiding the knife. It's a very common thing to try and make. I mean, we've all done it. I'm sure we've all done it to an extent. I very much doubt if someone says you behaved badly last night, the first thing that would come into your mind would be excuses.
No doubt about
it. That's normal. The difference is that, generally speaking, on reflection, not immediately, but on reflection, we look back and say, yes, actually, I knew what I was doing, and probably I knew it was wrong at the time, but I did it all the same. And there are some people who never do that, and they're not required to do it because they are actually encouraged to think in that way by all kinds of agencies. So, like, social workers or psychologists or psychiatrists and even lawyers and so on. So, with the case of the Southport case, I've noticed this. I haven't followed it terribly closely, but the little that I have read has not addressed the question, which to me is an obvious one, is whether he took drugs at any time. And you would expect that to be answered. Maybe he never did. I mean, I'm not saying he did, and I'm not saying he did it because he was taking drugs. But in a situation like that, it's such an elementary question, and yet I haven't seen any reports. I mean, I haven't followed it very closely. Maybe you have seen reports about that.
I've only seen Peter Hitchens speculating that could be a contributing factor.
Yeah, well, I haven't read Peter Hitchens on that subject, but he's right, and it seems very curious that no one talks about it, given that there have probably now been Encyclopedia Britannicas full of articles about that case, and yet it doesn't seem to be mentioned. And incidentally, there was another case. I don't remember whether the case in Nottingham. Do you remember that? Where
yes.
The chap killed 3 people. One of the young woman killed, her father was a GP, and he drew attention to the fact that no one had tested this man for drugs, even though that man was known to be consorted with drug dealers.
Why do you think that is? Is it because we've become so normalized to drug taking in our society, whether it's cannabis or Class A's?
I think there would be a large number. I can't prove this. Of course, this is all speculation, but I think there are large numbers of people who still attach to the idea that no harm can come from taking drugs because they're still stuck in the 1960s flower-type people. And that has sort of entered the culture, so that, you can take drugs. It's all right for you to take drugs because it doesn't do you any harm. And that is true in probably most cases. just as it is true that most people who drive while drunk get home perfectly safely. The numbers of people who crash while drunk compared with the number of people who drive drunk is small. Nevertheless, it's a large contribution to road deaths. So, I mean, it always used to be said, people would say, I always drive a bit better after I've had a drink. They said that. They used to say that. And I suppose you might even find one or two people of whom that might be true. I don't know. But as a kind of social policy, driving while drunk is not a very good one.
No. You reminded me of all the jokes that used to come out in the Northumbrian pubs that I would frequent growing up, where there's frequently jokes about, don't worry about having another pint, it's 5 and drive around here. Or you'd be playing pool and someone would say, he's on his 4th pint and he's really getting into it now. He's got his eye in. So yes, it seems to be a common cultural trait of the people of this country.
Yeah.
Let's stay on the topic of the framing of issues. So we've talked about how we often talk about addiction being a disease, and we strip away the moral agency of those people, the ability to make decisions in their own lives, and how they might have contributed to it. I'd like to turn to how we talk about people's economic situation. So politicians, if you listen to any of their solutions, they're always talking about the needs to lift people up out of some deprived situation, or the reason why things are a problem is it's a deprived area. Whilst the boats might be rising for people, we've got a relative poverty issue. And I think it's fair to say that you don't subscribe to that notion of viewing people in this economic way. And in fact, you say that this is indicative of pauperism. So maybe you can tell us what pauperism is and how it affects us.
Well, pauperism is a condition in which people have to accept what they are given. They or do accept what they're given. And in a sense, the NHS makes us paupers because we don't have any choice in the matter of what we get. And you can see down my doctor's surgery, people queuing up for an appointment, and when they get an appointment, it's like they've been awarded a medal. And it's very difficult to get an appointment. And so this actually, with regard to the medical treatment, it pauperizes them in the sense that they have to accept what they're given. And can't really go elsewhere. Now, it is true that they may get very good treatment, but they're still paupers. I mean, it's obviously many people do get very good treatment under the National Health Service. Many people don't, and it's trying to get treatment, certainly for anything that is not an emergency, is a very unpleasant process in Britain, which it isn't actually so much anyway in France, for example, where they spend about the same on healthcare as we do. So we have pauperized ourselves, and one of the things that has maintained that pauperization is a long lie, which was that the National Health Service was a tremendous achievement. And when we go out and start clapping the NHS, and thank you NHS, you'd think that no other country in the world had any doctors or any medicine or any hospitals or any care of anyone. And furthermore, in this country, before the NHS, there was no healthcare whatsoever either, which is a lie. It's a lie. But it has been successfully insinuated into the minds of the British population. I've forgotten what you asked now.
Well, I was asking about pauperism, what it is, which you described, but also how it affects us, and specifically linking it back initially to the way that we talk about poverty in the country, deprived people, deprivation, deprived areas, using that as a reason behind bad things happening. I know we've talked a lot about agency. I know this is another example, perhaps, of stripping people of agency. Maybe there's something else to add to it.
Well, I mean, one of the things that is devastating is the idea of the economy as a cake. And if you have a slice, then that's a slice I don't have. So the question is how we divide up the cake. And that is, I think, it's a disastrous way of thinking about an economy. I was once in a debate, I won't say who it was because I don't want to be personally nasty, but it was a journalist from The Guardian about the nature of poverty. And I pointed out that her own newspaper had recently published a survey of household wealth, not by social class or by employment or by education or by anything else, but by religious affiliation. And what was interesting is that the two richest religions were Judaism and Sikhism. And interestingly, both these groups had a certain degree of prejudice against them when they arrived en masse in this country. But within a generation or two, they were the most prosperous group when you look at at religious groups. And the person with whom I was debating said, well, of course they were immigrants, and immigrants often have a drive, a different character. I said, yes, that's precisely my point. My point is that poverty is not a state from which it is impossible to escape in a reasonably open society, as Britain still was, and to an extent still is, although I believe less so than it was. So that we're changing largely from a class to a caste society.
What do you mean by that?
It seems to me. Well, that actually it's more difficult to escape it's more difficult to escape the social milieu in which you were born than it used to be. Of course, it also means that there must be the possibility of going downhill as well as uphill. So, and I do know people whose children do precisely that. So the whole point is that if poverty were a condition from which it is impossible to escape, we could none of us ever have become richer. But even now, even the poorest person is in certain respects much richer than Louis XIV, lives a much more comfortable life than did Louis XIV, and certainly lives more comfortably than the poorest people 50 years ago or 60 years ago. You have only to look at photographs, shall we say, of the back streets of Newcastle 60 years ago to know that nobody lives like that now. So it simply isn't true that that one is just the victim of one's fate and nothing else. Of course, it's much easier for some people than others. Some are born with silver spoons in their mouth and some are not. And there is a level of misery and degradation from which it probably is almost impossible to escape. But that isn't the case with most people, even now. And yet we propagandize as if it were true. And the problem is that this forges the mind forge manacles, as William Blake put it. I don't know that he meant it in my meaning, but I think it's a very good line to describe what I'm talking about. If you believe that you can't escape from something, and there's no point in what you doing anything, then of course you won't make any great efforts. And there is that kind of attitude in Britain to a greater extent, I think, than in most countries.
I think what's also interesting about this pauperism, this psychological condition, is that even those people that you drew as an example, living in Newcastle back streets, you can say that people don't live like that now. I'm not entirely sure they suffered from pauperism, because when you look at photos of, say, there's some wonderful footage from the early 1900s that is resurfaced, where you see factory workers standing outside of buildings in Preston. They're working class, or they're in Blackburn, or they're in Newcastle. And they're dressed in their tweeds, they've got their flat caps. They look good. And that's different to, I know this isn't exactly the same point, but you walk the streets today and well-dressed people are absolutely in the minority, including amongst the more well-to-do classes. But those people who had not a lot, as we would say, they didn't have a pot to piss in, they didn't seem to grumble so much. In fact, there were always those stories of the hardy grandmothers who were just like, well, I never had that when I was growing up. And yet they still managed to birth these progeny that went on to make something of themselves. So they didn't have a, oh God, we're buggered story.
Yeah, well, I mean, there has been an enormous change. If you look at football crowds of 70 years ago, 80 years ago, they were well dressed. They seemed to be, I mean, they didn't always behave well. There is no golden age in all respects, but on the whole, they behaved pretty well. They were not vile. I remember I used to go to football matches when I was 11, on my own, or not on my own, with another boy of 11, 10 even. And there were huge crowds. And I can remember once, and in those days you stood up. The seats were for the richer adults, and they were in a minority. And I stood on the terrace with 40 or 50,000 people, and I remember hearing, and this is late 50s. People saying, no swearing, there are children present. Now, a newspaper sent me to a football match where we were all sitting. So the physical conditions were infinitely better than they had been. And I was sitting, and I'd been sent by the newspaper to report on what I saw. And am I allowed to swear on this? Yes. Anyway, there was a man and his son, and he looked perfectly normal to me. And something happened on the field, and the man stood up and started swearing and shouting and saying, I'll use what he actually said. This is a quotation. Who the fuck do you think you are? Who the fuck do you think you are? Now, that father was being watched by, I think his son was about 11, about the age that I remember people saying, no swearing, there's a child here. And this is I think, a significant change. Unfortunately, it has gone right throughout the whole of society. So vulgarization has occurred throughout society. The same newspaper sent me to Rome to watch a so-called friendly match between England and Italy. And there were 10,000 English fans there. There hadn't been anything like it since the downfall of the Roman Empire, 410. It was terrible. And these people was shouting abuse for hours on end, vulgar abuse. And it, of course, going to Rome for a football match, you have to have quite a large discretionary income. It's not the kind of thing that a very poor person can do. And actually, they were all middle class. And I asked the chap next to me at half time, because he was making a terrible noise the rest of the time, as they all were. I said, excuse me, I hope you don't mind me asking, but why have you come all this way to shout abuse at the Italians? And he said, you have to let your hair down. And so I said, why do you have to? To which he had absolutely no answer. And in fact, this kind of behavior is, there's a kind of a vicious circle, because the more you indulge in it, the more you indulge in it, and the more vulgar you have to be.
Yeah, it is remarkable, the difference between the middle classes, the cultural elite of today, compared to those in the past. And I suppose this is what philosophers of a more conservative bent would say: there is no noblesse oblige anymore. This idea of recognizing that you're in a different station in life, you ought to both steward everyone. You should make the most of the abilities and capabilities you have to lead by example and lift other people up. And I think at the beginning of this, we talked about how that pauperism didn't exist even amongst the lower classes. And indeed, they dressed quite a lot like the upper classes and comported themselves in a similar way.
Yeah, I mean, one particular fashion that I detest is people wearing torn jeans. And one of the reasons I detest it is that I've spent quite a lot of time in Africa, and once I crossed Africa by public transport, and I saw people from the bottom up. I mean, really, I was amongst very, very poor people, and they did everything they possibly could to make themselves look good and decent. And the idea that the spoiled brats of our country should try and look as if they have sympathy for the poor by wearing pre-torn jeans absolutely infuriates me. It revolts me, actually, because I've seen in really poor places the efforts people go to not to appear in rags.
That's a point I haven't really meditated on, but I can see how that is quite an exciting and not in a good way feeling to have. We've spoken quite a lot about the change we have seen within our culture. We've talked about non-judgmentalism. We've talked about the way that frame things, that removes agency from people. And I suppose it's fair to say that a lot of your writings are about understanding human nature and the importance of trying to do so you can make the right decisions, so you can either be a good governor or a good citizen. And David Stuckey, who I spoke to recently, he made the case, look, we need to go back to reading Shakespeare, Chaucer, Dostoevsky. You want to understand why people do things? These books will tell you don't need a self-help book. You don't need someone to come up with these fancy theories. You want to understand human nature, go back to people who lived it, a more humane way of seeing the world. And I think if I look at the nature of public conversation now, it's either obsessed with all of those topics we've made, or it's awash with statistics, or you'll see calls for making things relevant. So let's talk about school curriculum, for example, and all of those great writers we've talked about. Should we be concerned as a society to be making the curriculum relevant for today by modernizing it, bringing modern voices in? Do we need to reimagine Shakespeare and these other places where you can understand the great questions of humanity, or not?
Well, it seems to me that what education should be doing is actually making more things relevant to the children, enabling children to see the relevance of things which they don't have around them. So actually it should be irrelevant to their day-to-day lives, or largely irrelevant except in a philosophical or questioning way. So the assumption, of course, is that people can't enjoy things that are a little bit difficult, but that's actually not true. And I think it's I was very interested in this question in prison, because the assumption was, A, that prisoners were more or less brutes, and secondly, they were unintelligent brutes as well. But I never found that, actually. I never found that they were they could not be made interested in something other than their immediate circumstances. And I would have liked to try and extend the culture of the prisoners. It's very difficult to do because there are all kinds of bureaucratic obstacles. But it was something that I thought we should be trying to do with prisoners. I have no statistics to show that it would actually work or have a practical effect. But I feel that enlarging their cultural horizons would actually be enormously beneficial to them. And the fact that we deny children any deeper culture seems to me to be terrible.
Well, listeners to this podcast will know that you're preaching to the converted. There, there is certainly a few episodes on that topic alone. Before we move to subscriber-only questions for Substack paid subscribers, don't worry, I won't keep keeping you too much longer. You've been more than generous with your time. There's one more question which I ask all of my guests at the end of the show, which is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life that you once thought perhaps was set in stone, an absolute, and what was it that made you think differently?
This might seem a fairly trivial thing. When I was young, I thought how one appeared to others, the dress that one appeared in, was unimportant, and that only people who were either vain or self-obsessed gave any thought to how they appeared, how they dressed. I mean, I'm not particularly well dressed at the moment, but that doesn't matter. But I have changed my mind on that, because I think that what our sloppy way of dressing indicates is a kind of terrible narcissism. I have to accept you as you are, but you have to accept me as I am. And I'm not going to make any effort to please you as far as my own appearance is concerned. And so I've changed my mind on that. I used to admire bohemianism. Bohemianism isn't possible now. The trouble is, I would love to have been a bohemian, but you can't be a bohemian now because everyone is a bohemian. And where everyone is a bohemian, no one is a bohemian. Anyway, that's one thing that I've changed my mind about, that I think one does owe it to other people. It requires an effort on behalf of other people. It's not vanity. It's actually trying to please other people. It's a social... it's the difference between self-respect and self-esteem. Self-esteem is saying I'm a very important, good person intrinsically, and I don't have to do anything to be of worth. Self-esteem requires self-respect. Requires an effort and is other-directed. You have to imagine what other people are thinking in order to have self-respect.
Well, sage advice for everyone. Get out there, go and put some good threads on. If you don't own any, go and buy some. Have some self-respect. Theodore, before we move into the quick-fire questions for the subscribers, what are you working on at the moment? Anything we can expect coming out anytime soon? And where can people follow your work?
Well, I've written a few books. In fact, I'm writing a series of books which are just reflections on what I read. That's one thing I'm working on. And not long ago, I published a book about some forgotten writers who are buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. And they're not forgotten because they weren't good writers. It's just you can't remember everyone. And it was for me, a real journey. It was a very good journey of discovery because I had no idea about these people at all. I had no prejudices either in favor of them or against them. And what I discovered, of course, was that they all had something very interesting to say. Well, I'm doing the same type of book for Highgate Cemetery in London.
Interesting. Famous for Karl Marx, amongst many others. I think Herbert Spencer.
Yes, there are many there, but of course there are George Eliot is there. But there are many writers buried there of whom people have not heard and certainly wouldn't have read, even if the name rings a faint bell, which it will in I suppose graduates of literature, perhaps. I don't know what they teach in universities and literature now, but anyway, but certainly are now unread. And it's very interesting to go back to see, and without prejudice, because you don't know anything about them.
A wonderful project. When can we expect any of those to be published?
Well,
one of them's already published.
The one is already, the one about Père Lachaise Cemetery is already published, but under my real name, Anthony Daniels, and I published these books of my literary reflections. What I try to do is it's a kind of dialogue between the book and my life, as it were, because I think that's what reading should be, a kind of dialogue between your experience and what you witness and so on, and what other minds have thought about the same things. And I've published one is called what are they called? I've forgotten now.
So engrossed by the other people you're reading, you forgot what you were writing.
I forgot. Yes, quite often I do forget what I've written. These Spindrift Pages. That's taken from a poem by Dylan Thomas. These Spindrift Pages. That's the title of the book, which is just a series of reflections on what I've read.
Great. Well, I will certainly keep an eye out for those, and you've piqued my interest in the forgotten writers buried in Paris. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you on the main body of the show. I hope we get to speak again, and I'm sure there is much of it more we can talk about. Your writings are vast, as are your thoughts on things. For everyone else who'd like to listen to the subscriber-only section, then please do go and subscribe on Substack. Okay, Anthony, you don't have to be as generous with your time now. Subscriber questions. We have one here from Albion's Booze, which he says, and we touched on this before we started recording, he, I think being you, is fond of saying he doesn't make predictions or offer solutions, but it would be good to put him on this re the existential crisis we face in the West, and specifically here in Britain. In terms of political strategy, what should we do?
Well, it's easy to see some of the things we should do. It's rather difficult to see how they're going to come about. As the former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, not a very admirable man, said, we all know what to do, it's just we don't know how to get elected afterwards. And so actually what the strategy, if you're asking me what one should do politically, since I've never done anything politically, I'm not really the person to ask. But I suppose one should, for example, attend local council meetings, One should ask difficult questions. One should follow the local affairs. It's quite difficult to do, and it's not very interesting. But if we don't follow local affairs, then we can't really complain, or we can't really complain when everything goes to the dogs. So we don't hold, although we are nominally democratic, we don't hold any of our politicians to account very much.
So, sage advice once more. Go on.
Yeah. But I wouldn't hold out that this is going to usher in a golden age if you follow my advice.
Yeah, well, I think it's important advice because I think sometimes these questions are in the hope that someone will swoop in and save us from whatever it is that we don't want to be under the boot of, but in fact each of us actually have to play a part in the small part of the world we're in if we're not going to be part of that bigger national conversation. And in the spirit of advice, another subscriber, Dawson's Carpets, excellent name, has asked, what is your advice to young people, especially young men in Britain, who share your outlook on life? I think I might be getting at the notion that it's quite uncommon to find people with your worldview, and feels lonely, perhaps.
Yes. I mean, I know it is quite difficult because I have spoken to groups of young people like that, and it's always those meetings do have a hole in the corner kind of feeling about them, as if you're doing something illicit. What young people? Well, I think you can only live your life as you think it should be lived, and if you have any dialectical ability to discuss it, try and discuss it with people who think differently. And my trouble in answering this question is I don't really know any young people. I observe them, but I know very few of them, and the very few whom I know are already converted, so to speak. So yeah, I think it's very difficult. You can form associations, I suppose. People are interested in the same things. And try and meet people, like-minded people. Try to, if you have the ability, to discuss things with people, hold debates, write if you're able. But again, it's almost as if what I'm arguing for is some kind of religious revival, not of religion, but of ideas. But again, I'm not suggesting any of this would usher in a golden age very quickly.
Okay, well, gear shift here away from advice to what sounds like comparative parts of history here. NM Thursday has asked, can you ask him, his portraits of modern underclass life are compelling and persuasive, but how would you respond to the criticism that the Victorian, Georgian, Tudor periods all had the same problems? Are there any particular concrete differences he would point to in scale or severity?
Well, the first thing, of course, is that the comparison isn't really a just one, because we have the level of productivity and wealth now is enormous. So the disparity between the possibilities and the actuality are much greater now than they were then. If you just think of how difficult it would have been to do even the simplest things, for example, cut wood. Now we have, and I'm interested in this because I have a house in France and we cut wood. Cutting that wood without a machine, that we need to heat the house would be an exhausting labor. And now it takes a few minutes at most. So I don't think direct comparisons are just. And actually, if you're talking about Victorian period, in the mid-Victorian period, there was a tremendous change because society was very disordered during Georgian times. And by the end of the 19th century, it was at least as far as crime and so on is concerned, the best ordered society that really any large-scale society has ever been. It's true that there was drunkenness, and they dealt with drunkenness, actually, by certain restrictions. But there was a change in mentality. By the end of the Victorian period, people didn't see drunkenness as amusing or a good thing. They thought it was a kind of social sin, or at least a social weakness. That changed. So it's true that we are never going to achieve a society in which there's nothing to complain about. And I'm rather glad about that, actually, because
you made a living out of it.
I've made a living out of it. And actually, if you go around listening to people, if complaint were removed from human discourse, we'd be more or less silent. So I don't know whether I've answered the question. I hope I've given him something to think about.
I'm sure you have. And a final question, only because you've referenced France a couple of times. So someone without a pseudonym this time, Gary Powell, he's someone who's very engaged as a subscriber on Substack, and I value his contributions a lot. He asked, do you believe that a recognisably Western civilization can survive anywhere in Europe? If so, I wonder why, apart from its past glories, you choose to live in France, where it appears to be crumbling faster than anywhere.
I don't think it is. I mean, it's not. It's going backwards. It's crumbling, but I don't think it's worse than Britain. I think Britain is worse than France. And as I said, I think they're 20 years behind or something like that. And life in a lot of France retains a pleasantness which it doesn't have in Britain. Now, in part, that's because France is almost an apartheid society. So that you have areas. I remember I went to the banlieue of Paris, which are terrible. I mean, they're worse than anything in England, in my experience. And it's like a low-grade civil war. But they reminded me very much of the townships of South Africa. That is to say, you can isolate them, and you can turn off the trains, and you can block the roads, and as the South African policeman used to say, they are fouling their own nest. And this may not be true anymore. They may be able to come and foul the rest of the nest. But anyway, it is much easier in France to get away from the degradation, partly because it's a much larger country. It's more than twice the size of Britain, physically. It's easier to get away from the degradation in France than it is from England, where it's almost impossible not to see it the moment you leave your front door. As I walk down the street in my rather nice little town in England, I try to measure how long it is before I can hear some young person saying, "Oh, fucking this and fucking that." And it usually isn't very far. Well, you don't hear that in France.
Well, you have been very generous with your time. I can only hope that instead of France degrading to the point that Britain already has, that both of us book our acts up and sort ourselves out and do what we need to do with regards to maintaining some kind of civilization. Usually requires order.
I should just add that France is a much less corrupt country than Britain. Much, much less corrupt. Not in the sense of people putting money under the table and so on, and probably more corrupt in that sense. But intellectually and morally, it is better than our country, because even now, people who work in the public service do actually have some pride in what they do. If you just compare the way the roads are kept in France with the roads here, you can see that they're kept with pride there. And here, no one can even be bothered to pick up those notices that they have to put up when they put, roadworks. So our companies don't clear up. Our people who employ these companies don't clear up, and the population doesn't clear up. Well, you don't see that in France.
Good practical examples. It was interesting when you said it's not as morally or intellectually corrupt. For a moment, I thought you were referring to the academy, and I think Starkey would have pushed back at that. He said all bad ideas come from France, but I think you're right. I've spent some time in France over the summer driving on the road, and what you describe is true once you get out of some of the big cities where it really does feel like there's a huge divide ethnically within those cities. Is everything else just seems to be quite smooth and it works and you can get about. And yes, you don't feel that. I mean, up in Scotland, which is where I currently reside, highest income tax rates in the country, lots of council tax hikes of late, more expensive than in most parts of England. And you're lucky if you're not having to change your suspension every year because there's just potholes everywhere. Bins overflowing, highly socialized economy. Even the things that they own and get with regards to policy, the government gets to spend so much more than England does, and yet they have the worst achievement rates in education, the worst hospitals.
Well, I was in Edinburgh about a year ago, I suppose it was, and I was appalled by what it had become. I thought it was terrible.
When was the last time you visited? Before then?
Well, as I said, I think it was about a year. I mean, when everything at my age sort of concertines into a blob. But certainly it was by comparison with 10 years before. And I thought what it has become is terrible.
Well, turns out where we started the conversation, which was people with a conservative disposition tend to think the world's gone to the dogs. Well, it seems like we're both in agreement with that, and it's still going. Everyone, please stop letting the world go to the dogs. We've all got a part to play. Anthony, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's always so great to speak to people that I really admire and that I've read the words of for so long. So it's been really wonderful, and thanks so much for all of your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.